Okay, looks like it's 3 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the session today, the Mixed Methods webinar series brought to you by the Mixed Methods International Research Association, the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, as well as today's webinar is brought to you by QSR International. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. My name's Yvette. I work with IIQM, and I'll be co-hosting your session for today. You are all on mute right now, and you'll be on mute for the duration of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, we'll have time for a Q&A session. At that time, you can raise your hand, and we can give you the microphone, and you can ask your question. Or if you don't have a microphone, just write your name in the chat, or write your question in the chat, and then we'll read out those questions. So just to make sure everyone can hear me now, everyone on the line, if you can just in the chat say hello or let me know that you can hear me and the sound is good, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Perfect, some names coming in. Amanda, Rachel, perfect, thank you all very much. So today's webinar is brought to you by QSR International, developers of In Vivo, is supporting the webinar. Silvana De Grigio, the research director, will be introducing today's speaker. Silvana is a sociologist and qualitative researcher. She will also be fielding your questions after the presentation.
Thank you, Yvette, and thank you for having me. Okay, so my purpose today is to perhaps break down some barriers that have been imposed on researchers and to get us thinking about just doing research. So we're going to start by thinking about the nature of the phenomena that you study. And I actually need to find the way. Yeah, here we go. I'm going to argue that the phenomena that we study have both qualities and quantities. Anything we study has both. They can also be assessed in terms of time or space. They make sounds, they have colour, they have emotional significance. So there are lots of dimensions in any phenomenon that we study. So we need words and numbers. We perhaps also need images and multimedia, sound and so on, to record our observations. It's important to realise that the method we use doesn't change an object or experience, but it does change how we recall it, how we think about it, what follows on from it. The problem is that in the research world, research has largely been split into two separate camps. We've constructed a qualitative and quantitative divide. And so researchers tend to be trained in one or the other, primarily, and to see these as being two separate ways of tackling research. It's a construction that we've made. It's one that we impose on the multidimensional world that we study. Some years ago, I looked into how people described qualitative or differentiated qualitative and quantitative research, and came up with about 40-odd different ways in which people describe the differences. But the point about any one of these was that the way that was used to describe the quantitative end of a dimension could also be found quite often in qualitative research. And so they weren't exclusive. So what we had were divisions, but what we really needed were dimensions. And so I'm going to argue that if phenomena are multidimensional, we need multidimensional methods. We need to see these divisions not as divisions, but as dimensions. So for each of these things, any phenomena or any piece of research might be somewhere between the poles on the dimension. A piece of research might be exploratory, but there might also be confirmatory elements to it. Or it might be confirmatory, but some of it will be exploratory. It'll be somewhere in between. And for each of these dimensions, research is often somewhere between the poles, not at one end or the other. The point about dimensions is that there's no kind of middle boundary. There's no cut point in the middle. I'm not arguing that there is no such thing as being able to talk about quant or qual research. We each have a sense of, and we can attempt to describe quantitative and qualitative research, but the boundaries are unclear. The boundary between them is unclear, and there are ways of doing research that sit much more in the middle than at one side or the other. Bergman described these as being like two interrelated families, and so you're still recognizing one family and the other, but there's an interrelationship between the two. Another way of thinking about it, and it's Harry Evans that brought this to my attention, is what's called the pond-field metaphor. You have a pond in a field, and you can still clearly identify the pond and the field. And the pond and the field each have their purpose. You can swim in a pond, you can grow crops in a field, and you can't grow crops in the pond. But there's a muddy boundary, and the muddy boundary itself has a richness. That's where you can grow rice. So we can still have a sense of quantitative research and qualitative research, but there is an area where there is lack of clarity between them, or where in fact those terms are not useful for describing what's going on. So what does this mean for the way we do research? It means that we can use diverse data and methods while working towards a common purpose or goal. It means selecting data on the basis of what's needed or useful or available, rather than on whether it's quantitative or qualitative, so that we can reflect the multidimensionality of phenomena. Means recognizing and ensuring the interdependence of different elements in reaching the goal of the research. So think, for example, of protein exchange, a DNA double helix. So there's exchange between quant and qual, but they are interdependent in achieving the purpose of what you're doing. And it means seeing the potential for a more complete, but also for possibly conflicting results from your research. In the terms of Gorard and Siddiqui, there is only research. You think about doing research rather than think about doing qual research or quant research. Don't choose methods because they're quantitative or because they're qualitative. You choose methods because they will answer the questions that you're asking. This brings us into the area of what's generally called mixed methods research. And there's a problem here because standard definitions of mixed methods research assume and perpetuate a qual and quant divide. And if you look at the couple of definitions that are on your screen, you'll see that the common definitions all tend to say that mixed methods is a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods or approaches, or collects and analyzes qualitative and quantitative data. So in a sense, they are perpetuating the divide. They're saying that you have to have qual and quant for to be classified as mixed methods. Now, historically, if you go back to the early 20th century and before, methods were selected to fit a purpose, and there wasn't a big argument about using different kinds of methods together. I'm thinking particularly here, the area that I was most connected or aware of in my own work was of the work done by the Chicago School of Sociology in their community studies. And they used whatever data was available to understand the communities that they were studying. But by the mid-20th century, psychology, education, health studies, probably some other disciplines as well, were attempting to emulate the natural and clinical sciences to copy what they assumed were the objective methods of those disciplines. And so, for instance, I was trained in psychology, and we were taught that, we had to be objective in everything that we did. In the later 20th century, of course, we had the challenges to the hegemony of quantitative methods and the development of a naturalistic alternative that's particularly associated with Lincoln and Guber in 1985, and earlier work as well. This brought about an emphasis on epistemological foundations for research. What it is that knowledge is about and what justifies knowledge. So what this did was to create a boundary between methods that were assumed to be based on a constructivist, subjectivist approach, and or qualitative methods, in other words, and the so-called quantitative methods that were presumed to be based on a more positivist approach. So there was a division created, which I'm sure that most of you were aware of. So late 20th century, mixed methods began to be identified as a specific approach to methodology, and so there were these arguments about whether it was possible to mix methods. These were resolved largely in the later 20th century, and it was named as the third methodological movement in 2004. I've kind of jumped a bit to this slide, where there was this rise and fall of epistemological or paradigm conflicts in the mixed methods community. The resolution was largely found through accepting ideas of pragmatism and some critical realism and so on, that were epistemological bases that were supportive of the idea of bringing together different methods, or making use of different methods together. I don't want to get too deeply into the paradigmatic issues here, but just to say that these were issues that were largely a concern of the American educational community spreading into the psychological and health areas. It was very much evident in the American mixed methods community, and not so much a concern in other parts of the world. Anyway, there was this rise and fall of conflict, which further created a division, in a sense, between the idea of qual and quant research. I'm basically going to argue that whatever form of data you use is a representation of phenomena and involves interpretation, and this is where we're heading. So research transforms phenomena. It makes them visible. So this involves selecting the best form of data to represent each thing that you're looking at and converting these data into evidence. So whether you use text or numbers or pictures or sound or whatever, these can be treated as respondents' constructions. They have to be interpreted by the researcher. They can be treated like that, or they can be treated as representing reality and reported descriptively as what is. In fact, they can do both. We can argue that what we have, it represents at least the reality of those from whom it has been obtained, and we see it as their construction. We have to interpret what that data says. Both numbers and words are given meaning through theoretical and culturally based conventions. Numbers are as theoretical as words. If you're interested in that idea, just Google the history of the number 1. It's quite fascinating about where and how that developed, or the history of 0, and how 0 didn't exist in numeric sense for a very long time. So these are numbers are theoretical, words are theoretical as well, and they're culturally based. The point coming is that each requires interpretation. Both numbers and text require interpretation. Statistical output requires interpretation. It doesn't just stand on its own. And so I would argue also that warranting a conclusion has much more to do with the research design, with how you have built towards that conclusion, and eliminated alternative explanations, than whether the data are recorded as numbers or text. This leads me to an alternative definition of mixed methods in order to represent that multidimensionality. I'm arguing that because phenomena are multidimensional, they require a form of representation that captures their multiple dimensions, but also a perspective in which these can build together to represent the coherence of the whole. So this means that we're nearly always going to be wanting to get multiple kinds of data in order to get a fuller representation of what it is we're studying. But we also need to keep that coherent. So my definition of mixed methods is that they are studies where more than one source or type of data, or more than one approach to analysis of those data, are integrated in such a way as to become interdependent in reaching a common theoretical or research goal. So there's two key points here. You might have more than one source or type of data, or you may have one type of data, one source of data, but different ways of analysing it. The point is that it doesn't, I'm not suggesting that it has to be a quant and a qual source of data. That you might have two different ways of analysing something qualitatively, or two different ways, two different quantitative approaches to analysing or understanding something. And as far as I'm concerned, you are still combining methods, mixing methods. key thing that defines mixed methods, from my point of view, then, is that integration occurs, and I see integration as creating the interdependence between the methods. This can occur iteratively throughout a project as information and ideas flow from one method to another. I'll expand on some of these as we go. But yeah, it can occur deliberately as you design into a project points where different approaches are brought together. It occurs, to my way of thinking, primarily through data management and analysis. And that's what I'll mainly be talking about. It also occurs reflectively throughout the project as the thoughts that you have, prompted by the various data sources, are drawn into a coherent set of inferences. That's happening, that's part of the iterative thing too, that you're working with your data, you're reflecting on it, and ideas from one source of data or one type of data or one approach that you're taking to analysis will impact on how you approach with the other form of data or analysis. And integration also occurs critically, evidentially, in the way that you record the results of the study. And I'm arguing that it's evident before the discussion point. So my way of distinguishing mixed methods from multi-methods is that multi-methods often are used and then just the conclusions are combined in the discussion. To me, that's more of a multi-method approach than a mixed method approach. Okay, what does this mean in practice? Well, clearly you need to focus on your research purposes and questions, and that provides the coherence for what you're doing. You'll explore the problem from multiple perspectives. Whatever you're looking at, you'll explore from multiple perspectives. And you won't be thinking about, I have to have a quantitative and a qualitative method to satisfy a requirement for mixed methods. You'll think rather about what are my questions asking, what data do I need to answer my questions. You'll judge that data by its relevance rather than its form. The methods will be integrated during analysis and during writing as well. And very much it benefits from use of computer technology. So, just to expand on these various points, this is a pretty classic diagram, but it does make the point that we need to engage with multiple perspectives. We need to see multiple dimensions. There is the problem that you can have that if you take different views of things, if you only take those views, you may get a very biased perspective. The problem if you take multiple perspectives is that by taking different cuts through, as Pritchard and Dorney have recently pointed out, you may get conflicting results because you've taken different cuts into something. So, but overall, you're going to do better if you take multiple perspectives in order to get multiple dimensions. In practical terms, explore the possibilities of what you're going to investigate using, and if you are using in vivo or indeed other QDAS programs. So I'll be drawing in my examples from in vivo for this presentation, but other forms of qualitative software such as MaxQDA and so on will allow you to do similar things, although not necessarily exactly the same. Anyway, you can explore the possibilities of what you want to investigate in a mind map. Just plomp ideas onto a screen. It's a great way of just getting ideas down, moving them around, and so on. And in vivo, that converts into a coding system if you wish. The other thing you can do is to map the ideas in a concept map, so that you're checking your assumptions, you're mapping out how you think things are linked together. So these two diagrams do different things. You probably use one or the other, although you may do both. The point is that using diagrams is a particularly useful way of exploring what you think your ideas are. Just getting ideas down and being able to move them around. The beauty of doing it on a computer is that you can push ideas around the screen and experiment with links and see what works and what doesn't. Just explore your ideas as a way of getting started in thinking about what is it I'm investigating here. So back to my point about designing using whatever data are relevant and available. So you might have a whole mix of bits and pieces. The project that I've been working on recently on well-being for older women has used surveys, it's used evaluation surveys, it's used interviews, it's used free listing and pile sorts, it's used discussion groups and so on. So it's used a whole range of different methods in order to explore and investigate the topic that I'm interested in. So you might start with what seems like a bit of a chaotic mess. Gradually it gets shaped into something that becomes a whole thing, or represents a whole phenomenon. So I'm suggesting that there are a number of ways of integrating analyses within and across methods at the analysis stage. And so, yeah, I've got a few C words here. I think co, because co goes together and the words seem to all start with the co. So you might construct one method based on another, or combine in complementary analysis, compare across data types and sources, convert data from one form to another, or compile using all sources together, and I'll elaborate on each of these. So the key ones to me in analysis are the combine, compare, and convert approaches. But there is always the potential to disrupt integration through complexity, conflict, and confusion. And we'll talk a little about how to deal with that as well. So combining different data sources, this is a sort of a weaving together suggestion here that you have all the different sources, different bits and pieces of information from different sources, and you weave them together to create a narrative. And you might do this on paper. In fact, the example there is comes out of my PhD thesis in the 70s when we only had paper. And the system I used there was to have a notebook with topic headings at the top of pages, and I would drop in any statistical results or any observations or any qualitative comments under the topic on the various pages as I was working through different data sources. And so that meant that when I came to writing up, the data from all the different sources on each particular aspect of the topic I was studying were brought together, were already brought together, and I just had to turn them into prose. The more modern way of doing that would be to use headings in Word and a document map and drop your ideas in under different headings and gradually bring them together. And in fact, that's the way I write these days, is to use Word with headings showing in the navigation pane at the side of the document. And as I'm thinking about a topic, I'll drop ideas in under a heading, and when I think I've got enough information or when I feel confident about it, I can write that section of whatever I'm writing. Or, of course, excuse me, you can use computer software, such as NVivo, to store data from multiple sources. And what this screenshot shows is a shot from NVivo showing, in this case, the wellbeing project that I'm working on. Files of from different sources are sorted into different folders. And it just shows you the range of sources that I'm using. And then when you retrieve information on any particular topic, then the program will bring the data from all those different sources together for you to review. So that's also helps you then with the combining different sources to write description or narrative, or to think more deeply about that particular aspect of the topic. The second main approach I suggested was comparing, and the critical or the best contribution of software for this is to where you can import quantitative data, demographic or quantitative data, for whatever it is that you're studying. So the units of analysis or the cases that you're studying, you can import their demographic information, or indeed you can import scaled data and things like that. And so for my wellbeing study, I have, for the people that are involved in that that I'm studying, I have information about their age. This is mostly older women, but I have their particular age group. I have a wellbeing scale score. I have also a health scale score, and I have also things like what activities they're involved in and so on. And so I can use a crosstab tool in NVivo to look at how these people talk about well-being, or about their health, or about their life more generally, or about the process of aging. How do they talk about those things? And then I can split up how they talk about something for different subgroups, where the subgroups are based on a quantitative measure or a demographic measure. So I could compare the older old with the not so old in how they talk about something, how they talk about well-being, for example, or their health. Or I can compare, in the one I'm showing here, is how they talk about some aspect of well-being according to their score on a well-being scale. And so you know, I've determined I've coded from their discussions of well-being some various aspects of what well-being means for them, and those are the codes or nodes that are listed on the left-hand side of that crosstab. So they talk about being motivated, about having independence, self-care, aspects of physical health, being active, social connection, and so on. Things that impinge on their well-being or are dimensions of the well-being. And then I can sort what they say about that by whether they are a high, moderate, or low level of well-being according to a WHO scale. This allows me to do a couple of things. It allows me to further explore the dimensions of well-being, or whatever it is you're studying. If you break it up according to maybe some demographic categories, maybe you're comparing males and females, or in the academic work I've done, senior academics with junior academics, and you compare what they say. First of all, you've got some descriptive data to compare those groups. But also, what you tend to find is, what you can often find, is that different groups will talk about something in a different way, and so that alerts you to different dimensions within the topic that you're studying. So further dimensionalizing, further understanding the topic that you're studying by seeing that different groups talk about it differently. That raises further questions for you, like why is it that this group talks about that differently? And that sends you off to exploring your data in another way. So that's the first thing it does, or one of the things it does. The other thing that this kind of analysis does is allow you to, say, for instance, validate a scale. So if you're developing a scale for something, you can, or you want to see what a scale point means, then you can compare what people say about a topic, like pain, say, and compare it with the way they measured themselves on a scale for pain, and see what 6 out of 10 on a pain scale means to someone in their experience. Or if you're developing a scale, say, for well-being, you can, or depression or whatever, you can check whether the scale points actually differentiate people's experience using this kind of comparative technique. The third main approach that I suggested for analysis is to convert. So you can take your coded data and turn that coded data into variables, and so this gives you a different way of looking at the same data. So you've looked at it qualitatively, you've coded it, you've got ideas about what the data is saying, but if you convert those codes into variable data, and that just means doing an export of all your cases, whether they did or didn't talk about a particular topic or that you've coded, export that as a table, take it into SPSS or another statistical program, where you can generate, well, some descriptive statistics, but also you can start to test differences between groups. So you can run comparative statistical tests, or in fact you can develop some regression analyses and so on. So, for example, in a study that I was involved in some years ago. We were looking at what judges, the sorts of things that judges took into account when awarding compensation in motor vehicle accident cases. And so we used the judges' summaries of the cases, and as an outcome we had the amount of money that was awarded. And so you could take what kinds of things the judge picked up on or took into account in his judgment, and look at how that impacted on the amount that he awarded as compensation. And you could do that one variable at a time, or you could look at it and build, if you have enough cases, build a regression analysis to predict, to build a predictive model of what will lead to a high or a low, or what amount should be compensated. This is of use to, for example, to insurance companies, because if they know the kinds of things that a judge will take into account, they can maybe make a pre-offer of compensation that's realistic and avoid cases having to go to court, as for example. If you do this kind of conversion, you can just run statistics on the data that you've got from the qualitative analysis, or you can add it to quantitative data, an existing set of data, and create a consolidated database for further analysis. And it's possible also to combine code data with variable data and create new kinds of variables that you can then use in further analyses. The important thing when you're doing this kind of conversion is to interpret all of the statistical analyses you do in the light of the underlying qualitative data. So you've done a conversion, you've run some stats. You need to go back and review or keep in mind all the time the qualitative data that data came from, because that's going to have implications for some of the statistical assumptions to start with, but also for what those statistics actually mean. So I suggested that taking different views of things and using different methods can create complexity and conflict. Indeed it can. Conflicting results can arise from complexity in the phenomenon. Maybe you've got more than one phenomenon entangled together and you hadn't realized, or you've taken different cuts and those different bits that you looked at are actually showing you different aspects of the phenomenon, and it appears to be in conflict. So those conflicts might come from methodological differences. You can get conflicting perspectives in team members, and so they look at things in different ways and find it difficult to reconcile. Or you can have divergent cases that also stand out and appear to be in conflict with the rest. These problems are tackled by reviewing your methods first of all to see if there's a methodological explanation for why you're getting differences in your results, to check your theory. In fact, if you have a unifying theory that guides your data selections and analysis, that will tend to reduce the likelihood of conflict. Basically, you need to return to your data and review it. You may need to add new data. You might need to create some blended variables so that you can explore further. compare outliers at the two extremes, or you can look at the particular cases that stand out and do an intensive analysis of those cases. If you're working statistically, you can drop one case at a time, alternatively from your sample to see if that makes a difference, or drop one variable at a time from your regressions and see what difference that variable makes. So that these are ways of, that's what jackknifing is about, and they are ways of seeing which particular case or which particular variable might be causing discrepancies in your results. The outcome from all of this typically is that you'll develop fresh and new understanding as a consequence. The final key to integration is the analytic writing. Writing during analysis is a starting point. I suggested earlier about making notes under topic headings as you're working. And if you keep writing notes, writing reflections, memos, journals, whatever, either in a in the qualitative software or in Word at the same time, keep writing to reflect. It helps you to reflect on and deepen your understanding. So I'm also suggesting that it's critical to integrate the different results, the multifaceted results, before you reach your conclusions. So do it during development, do it as you're working. And you design your results around the issues to be discussed rather than methods. I kind of have a sinking feeling every time I look at the outline of an article I'm about to review and see a section that's got qualitative results and a section that's got quantitative results. If you are studying a topic, then it's the topic that determines the structure of your writing, not the method that you've used to study it. And so the topic, you will combine what you've learned through the different methods under aspects of the topic, and these are the things that structure your writing. So you'll journey towards a conclusion to capture the whole. By telling a story or building an argument, you'll use your log trail or audit trail to help gather your evidence. But all the time, the focus is on the topic. You are studying a phenomenon. That phenomenon is not split into the quant aspect and the qual aspects. Those are integrated within the phenomenon. Make sure they're integrated within your writing as well. So my take-home message is that multidimensional phenomena require multifaceted methods to produce multidimensional data. Think about your purpose, data, and method, not whether you are using a quant and a qual method. I also suggest that you are not so concerned about trying to put a label on your design or your method. In fact, if you're going to label it, as Maxwell suggests, you're more likely to come up with the label afterwards than while you're planning. Labels are not so important as describing in detail what you did so that a reader can see how you reach the conclusions that you reach and assess their validity or value based on that, not on the label that you give it. So the data that you use needs to be integrated to coherently represent that holistic phenomenon. Integration occurs throughout a project, and especially during analysis, and it flows through into writing and reporting. integrative processes definitely benefit from the use of software. So, yeah, and if I could just be cheeky enough to finish with a the references for this presentation, which you can check later if you wish, and also just to say that there are a number of books that I've written that you might find helpful in following through these ideas. Okay, and so, right, questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Pat. So we'll open the floor up to questions, and Sylvania will facilitate those. So if you have any questions, you can just write them below in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can give you the microphone so we can hear your voice. So don't be shy. Go ahead and ask your questions.
Silvana.
Yeah, g'day.
Hi, great presentation. Thanks a lot. Just while people are typing their questions, I just thought I would comment first of all that I think it's great that you actually show the historical politics starting from early 20th century about this qual-quant divide, and also how that also affected a bit the mixed methods community. I love your focus on multi-dimensions and the fact that mixed methods can mean, two different approaches using qual or quant, and not, focusing on that. But I just wondered about the politics of this. I mean, what is your sensitivity or feeling about the acceptance of your looking at it? I mean, are there still political tensions in terms of keeping a qual-quant divide?
Yeah, there is, and for instance, the Journal of Mixed Methods Research requires that you have a quantitative and a qualitative method.
Right.
That's one of their requirements. Now, some of the studies that I've read in that journal, you could argue that the two methods used, or in fact, it may be more than two. Of course, it doesn't just mean you use two methods either. A lot of studies you'll use half a dozen different ways of gathering data. At least that's what I've found in quite a few of the studies I've conducted. But there have been studies published in the JMMR that you could classify as having had two quant methods or two qual methods, and it's really what that raises is the issue of what I call hybrid methods. For instance, is content analysis a quantitative or a qualitative method? If you're starting with text, but you're counting words, is that a qualitative method or a quantitative method? And you could argue it's well. I have a category of method I call hybrid. There are a number of hybrid methodologies that actually, as part of their methodology, require a quant and a qual component. Classic examples here would be qualitative comparative analysis, or even social network analysis is a hybrid method. And so, although there's this so-called requirement of a quant and a qual method, I think there are ways that one could argue around it. But yeah, I would think it's possible to well, that's just one particular community. I mean, it's been particularly a feature of the American, or part of the American mixed methods community, that there's been this emphasis, and it's been much less so in Europe and in UK and Europe, where if you think back to Bryman's study from 2007 or so, and he found that people just didn't even raise paradigm issues. It wasn't in their thinking at that stage. So it's something that's come out of particularly the American educational community.
Right. Yes. So the questions are coming fast and furious now. So thank you for answering that. So I'll just go through people's questions. So Marcy wants to know if you have publication examples for the combined approach you mentioned, or is it in your book?
Yeah. Virtually every point I make in my book, I illustrate with an example. So, can I just refer you to the books, Glenn? Yeah.
Right. Okay. So there are in the books. Kelly thanks you and wants to know, how does multi-methods relate to or differentiate from action research?
Action research typically uses more than one approach. So the critical thing is what's done with the data. So it meets that requirement of typically having more than one approach to gathering data and looking at it. The critical thing is whether those data are integrated or whether you still just keep looking at them as separate pieces of data. So, action research, of course, usually has a strong community component in it as well. It has a particular focus of wanting to create change or provide information that fosters change, and so on. So it has a particular purpose, but typically it involves use of mixed multiple methods, and typically those also could be classified as mixed methods, assuming that the different sources are integrated.
Right. Okay. Anna would like you to talk a little bit about validation in mixed methods research.
My general approach to validation, or rigor, or whatever you want to call it, in research is that you have to build an argument to for your conclusion based on the data that you have, and so you will engage in a number of tests along the way of exploring alternative arguments, looking at basically looking at alternative arguments or things that may it's about whether you are able to present an argument for the conclusions that you're reaching and support them with the evidence that you have from your data. So it's not any specific method. It's about having well-supported arguments and being able to always to go back and show how those came from your data. How did you arrive at those ideas from your data? Then the reader can assess whether they agree with the evidence that you've presented. So that applies to both mixed methods and qual methods, and in a sense also to using statistics and so on. Same kind of thing. You're presenting an argument. Here's the statistical argument. Does it support the conclusion that you want to draw from it?
Right. So it's about, as you're saying, it's about presenting the evidence and whether that's statistical evidence or providing the qual evidence. or in both,
Yeah.
sort of integrated. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So I have another question that's come up here. Okay. Is there a mixed methods designed to use YouTube videos or movies as a data set? And how can integration be achieved in such designs?
I would just see that as another source of data. So you can incorporate YouTube videos and movies within within your qualitative software if you are using qualitative software. How you analyze it, it is, or if you're using software, you're probably going to code it. I'm currently attempting to write a chapter on analysing visual data. I'm not sure I've got all the answers yet. But essentially you're looking at whatever way you're looking at analysing that data, you're still going to potentially, if you're thinking in mixed methods terms, you're going to be incorporating or combining that with other data. Using the kinds of techniques I've suggested mainly combining, I would think, rather than converting or yeah. So you'd mainly be weaving what you've learned from that in with what you learned from other sources. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, there's not a mixed methods design. Yeah.
Yes, as you say, it's another type
It's
of
simply
data,
another source of data. Yeah.
which you could analyze according to your purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it helps.
Along with whatever other data you have.
Yeah, and also the metadata that might be attached to it. Yeah,
where did it come from? And because visual data, you're usually looking at the context from of that visual data. How was it developed, or how was the film taken, or how was the image taken? What circumstances and how was it used, and so on, may also be very relevant in what you're looking at.
Right. Okay, so Yvette, I think we've gone. We've done an hour.
Yes. Thank you all very much for that. Pat, wonderful presentation. Sylvania, thank you for joining us today from QSR. I'd just like to remind everyone that in June we have another Mixed Methods webinar. Timothy Guterman will be speaking on joint displays to facilitate integration of qualitative and quantitative research. So your support is very well appreciated for these webinars. We can't do them without you guys showing up, so we do appreciate everyone who's able to come and listen to these sessions live. Pat, did you have any take-home messages or any final words?
No, just the ones that are on the take-home message that's currently on the screen.
Perfect. Okay, we'll end it there. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll hopefully see you next month on June 11th. Bye.